The New York Giants stink, but for whatever reason, I actually think that they are a fixable unit. This is a team that sits at the very bottom of the NFC East and is competing for a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. This comes, obviously, 1 year removed from their playoff appearance last year where they beat the Minnesota Vikings in the wild card game. And despite the fact that many people are giving up on this New York Giants team, I refuse to give up on them this early. They have many problems, but I think there are a couple steps that you can take to potentially fix this current New York Giants roster. But before we do that, let's go ahead and look at a couple of unique stats for this New York Giants football team so we can better understand just how bad this team really is. On offense, this team ranks dead last in the NFL in points per game, yards per game, points per play, and yards per play. They rank second to last in touchdowns per game and third down conversion rate, and they rank 30th in the entire NFL in red zone scoring percentage. And yes, this offense is bad, but so is this defense. On defense, they rank 29th in points per game, 27th in opponents' yards per game, 30th in opponents' points per play, 30th in opponents' yards per play, and 31st in opponents' touchdowns per game. But despite the fact that this team is playing arguably the worst football in the entire NFL, I still think that they are a fixable unit. Let's go ahead and look at some bright spots for this team. Dexter Lawrence is a total stud and is going to be a cornerstone for this defense for many years. Andrew Thomas is arguably a top 5 left tackle in the entire NFL, so I think he's definitely a big part of their future. Saquon Barkley is nice, but I don't think he's a part of the future. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Deontay Banks and Jalen Hyatt have bright futures for this New York Giants football team, and Kayvon Thibodeau is a young prospect who I think has some potential to be a decent pass rusher. There are also a couple other names who I think should also be mentioned in this one. Guys like Bobby Okereke are definitely a part of their future as well. But overall, this is a unit that needs kind of an overhaul of talent. Now, before we get into how I think this team can potentially become a good team in the future, I wanted to kind of directly address Brian Daboll. Do I blame Brian Daboll for the lack of success this year? Yes, but also no. A part of me says yes because this team does not look anything like they did last year, and whether that is just the fact that they are playing at a much worse level than last year, or maybe that last year they just overperformed, is something that I just truly cannot really tell you guys. I'm not a diehard Giants fan. I do watch a little bit of film on this team, and I've been recently watching a little bit of film of last year's performances to this year's performances, and truthfully, a lot of the stuff they ran last year is very similar to the stuff they've run this year, just at a much worse level. Again, I'm not an expert on this team, so Giants fans can let me know. Do you guys think Brian Daboll is the issue? For myself, like I said earlier, yes and no. On offense, they run the ball 44.96% of the time, which ranks 7th highest in the NFL, but despite the fact they run the ball a crap ton, they only average 3.9 yards per rush. There are many factors to that. For starters, defenses are stacking the box a ton more against this New York Giants team because they can't really rely on Daniel Jones or Tommy Trevino or Tyrod Taylor to pass the ball effectively. And going on with that pass game, the receiving core has just not been very great, so that obviously does hurt the fact that they can't run the ball much either. And next, the interior of the offensive line, mainly the 2 guard positions, are just straight out horrible. I like what I've seen from, of course, Andrew Thomas and John Michael Schmitz, but everyone else is bad. And last year, they were able to overcome their lack of interior success due to the fact that they were really creative with their run fits, but this year, it just has not seen that same success. And of course, in the pass game, it has just been horrible. Their average yard per pass is 4.8, which ranks them second last in the NFL, and their quarterback sack rate is 15.21%, which obviously ranks them dead last in the entire NFL. So how do you actually fix these problems this team is currently facing? Well, I think there's a couple steps you can take to actually get your team going in the right direction. For starters, I'm replacing Daniel Jones. Say what you want to say about Daniel Jones, but he is not a top 15 quarterback in the NFL. I'd argue he's probably not even a top 20 quarterback in the NFL. And when you're in a conference with guys like Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, Geno Smith, and in an NFL with guys like Patrick Mahomes, Herbert, Lamar Jackson, so on and so forth, Daniel Jones is not good enough to win a championship. And due to the fact that this Giants team is more than likely going to have a top 5 pick, and the fact that this draft class is loaded with quarterback talent, I think you have to go out and get one. Now, I know what you guys are saying. Well, what do you do with the Daniel Jones contract? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but I just want to briefly talk about some of these young quarterbacks in this year's draft. Of course, the best quarterback prospect in this draft is going to be Caleb Williams. I don't see the Giants being bad enough to potentially get him, but at the same time, if that Chicago Bears team does get the number 1 overall pick and decides to stick with Justin Fields, then there maybe could be a chance that Caleb Williams falls to the New York Giants. I don't really have to go into too much detail regarding Caleb Williams. He's a total stud. We already know this. The next one would be Drake May, and I think this one's a little bit more realistic. The only thing I will say about this player is I'm not a huge fan of Drake May. I do believe that he is NFL talent, and I do think he could be a successful quarterback, but I don't think he has the upside to be a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. I could be completely wrong, and I've been wrong multiple times. I'm the same person who said Justin Herbert was not going to work in the NFL, but I've also said some pretty smart things like Bryce Young was not going to be as good as CJ Stroud. So I'm 50-50 right now on this one. I'm not a huge fan of Drake May, but somebody I am a huge fan of, Michael Penix Jr. He may be a bit more risky of a player, but I think if you want to take a risk to get a Josh Allen level quarterback, Michael Penix Jr. is your guy. Now, unlike Josh Allen, Michael Penix Jr. is not much of a scrambler, but I do think there's enough there on film to make you feel confident that he's going to be able to move around in the pocket and make plays on the run. The biggest strengths of Michael Penix Jr. is going to be his accuracy and his decision making, which are 2 things that I just don't feel like Daniel Jones is all that great at. If you want your next CJ Stroud, and you can't get Caleb Williams, I think you get Michael Penix Jr. As of today, I would say he's my quarterback 2 in this year's draft. Of course, we still have a long offseason to go with the draft combine and all the other stuff that happens with that, so we'll see if that stays firm. But for now, assuming he does come out into this year's draft, I'm going to take Michael Penix Jr. for the New York Giants. So getting back to what I mentioned earlier about what you do with Daniel Jones, well, I think you have to figure that out in the best way you can. You have a couple unique options. For starters, you could just keep him on the roster. This would probably come with likely a bit of a pay cut, and you can potentially still have him as your starter as you potentially warm up Michael Penix Jr. to take that spot. Or you can just, like I mentioned earlier, have him do a pay cut and just sit him on your bench and be a good backup. Your next option would be to potentially find a trade partner for Daniel Jones. With his contract, I just don't see any team really wanting Daniel Jones, but if you can find a way, then go for it. The next one, and probably the scariest one for the New York Giants, you just straight up cut him. I don't know exactly how much dead space that would create on your roster, but I'd imagine it would not be worth it. So that is why that is probably my third scenario. The next thing I am doing is finding a way to fix the offensive line, the receiving core, and replacing Saquon Barkley. Now, I know what you guys are saying. Why would you get rid of Saquon Barkley when you just drafted a rookie quarterback? Let's be honest, guys. Saquon Barkley is too good for this roster. And a team that is going in the more youthful side of things does not need an older running back who's going to take up cap space. I am a huge fan of Saquon Barkley, but I just don't think that we needed an older running back to go on a team that is going to be rebuilding and probably won't be very good next year. And for the Giants' sake of things, giving him a big contract does not make any sense either. As it goes for the receiving core, there's a ton of really solid receivers in this upcoming draft. A realistic prospect that I think would fit this New York Giants team that they can potentially take in the second round would be Adonai Mitchell, the receiver for Texas. At the end of the day, you're not going to be able to probably take a Marvin Harrison Jr. or a Roma Dunze or one of those Ohio State receivers. But if you want a receiver with receiver one upside, who's a very solid route runner, who can create separation and can also catch contested balls, I think Adonai Mitchell is your guy. This is a team that does not necessarily need a slot receiver, nor do they need a guy who's going to go out there and be a speedster, because they already have Jalen Hyatt, Sterling Shepard, guys like that. They really need an alpha dog, and I think AD Mitchell has that alpha dog mentality. And to work on this offensive line, it's going to be very difficult. At the end of the day, it is super hard to find offensive linemen in the 3rd and 4th rounds, so I probably would not waste my time trying to find an offensive lineman unless one just falls down randomly. More than likely what I would do if I was the Giants would just to be to find some depth at the cornerback or defensive line room with those draft picks. So I think in the free agency class, you'd probably have to get super aggressive finding some decent guards and tackle prospects. You already have your left tackle figured out. You already have your center figured out. I think if you could find a solid right guard and right tackle replacement, I think that'd be very smart. Evan Neal has been horrible at that tackle position. I wonder if he can potentially move in as a left guard next to Andrew Thomas, but that's kind of a hypothetical situation. The next thing I am doing, and this is maybe a personal suggestion, but I would fire Wink Martindale. I've just never been a huge fan of him and his schemes. I would still want a guy who runs a lot of man coverage because ultimately this is what this team is used to and is kind of good at. I would love to see Raheem Morris be the defensive coordinator for this team, but that's just kind of an unrealistic suggestion. What I would do if I was the New York Giants is I would look at the LA Rams defensive assistants as well as the 49ers defensive assistants and of course the Dallas Cowboys defensive assistants to see if I can pull one from those teams. The number one guy who I would be looking at would be Al Harris, the secondary coach for the Dallas Cowboys. I've heard nobody really talking about him, but I think he could be a great defensive coordinator in this league. And that Dallas Cowboys secondary has been one of the best in the entire NFL in big part because of Al Harris. And he's one of those guys who makes his players very accountable. He
throws a deep ball down the left side, broken up by finding the ball.
That's a drop.
How is that a drop?
Coach, we do hands out the jaws. That's a drop.
No,
Yeah.
you're reaching.
He's a personal coach that I think a lot of players would fall in love with, and he would bring in a youthful energy that I think this team could desperately use. Lastly, I would take a very calculated approach to free agency. At the end of the day, you cannot give these massive contracts to players who are not going to be a part of your long-term future. But with that being said, you also want to give yourself a chance to remain competitive given the fact that Michael Penix Jr. is your long-term quarterback. The positions I would look to find solid replacements for would of course be along the offensive line. I think some depth in the secondary as well as in the defensive line could definitely be useful. But I would mainly try to go out there and potentially get a Micah Hyde or a Budda Baker to add to the secondary. Those are veteran players who have been around in this league for many years and are still very good at playing football. They can be a part of this defense for the next 3 to 4 years and still play at a super high level. And on the defensive line side of things, I would try to find a veteran guy who can still play really solid football. Yannick Ngakoue is the number one prospect who I think would be a great fit for this New York Giants defense. And for the offensive line side of things, it's obviously hard to go out there and not say a big name guy who's going to get a big contract. But if you are looking for a decent guard who can come in and make an immediate impact, I think Connor Williams would be a decent prospect for them to pick up. But I'm sure they can find multiple guys who can come in for relatively cheap to come in and fix some of their problems. This is a fixable team, and I've laid out a couple of different steps they could potentially take to fix their roster. And fortunately for this team, your team is bad enough to have a top 5 pick in this upcoming draft. Sometimes having a really bad year can be a blessing in disguise. Hell, ask the Dallas Cowboys, as this is a team that had a horrible 2020 season, and what did it get for them? Trevon Diggs and CeeDee Lamb. So as long as this team makes the right selections in the draft, they can completely turn around their entire franchise. But you guys let me know what you guys would do if you guys were in the New York Giants situation. Would you go out there and continue on with Daniel Jones as you think he is the future? Or would you be like me and potentially take a top quarterback in this year's draft? And of course, if you did enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as share this video to all your friends and family who might enjoy NFL content as well. But I love you guys. Peace.